Just a quick note on us, Maine Lakes is a statewide lake conservation organization. We have a homeowner incentive program called LakeSmart that hopefully many of you have heard about. We offer support and resources for our Lake Association members. We have a Lakes Alive outdoor education program that is undergoing some changes this summer. We're in a big planning phase for that. And we spend a lot of time in Augusta working on lake-friendly advocacy. So MaineLakesSociety.org is where you can find out more about us. But without further ado, I want to introduce Eric Topper. His talk is Native Plants for LakeSmart Landscaping. Eric has been in Maine since 2002, working to advance numerous initiatives that teach and inspire both social and environmental responsibility. I was lucky enough to work with Eric for many years at Maine Audubon, where he oversees all education programs, including school programs, camps, family events, and trips. Eric also has extensive experience in communications, fundraising, program development, and a proven record of increasing capacity, enriching curricula, and improving operational efficiencies. And I saw all of that in action at Maine Audubon. Before his time at Maine Audubon, he spent 12 years instructing courses and managing programs for Outward Bound. He and his family live in Portland, where they grow native plants and explore the wild parts of Portland, of which there are many. So hopefully Eric is close by.
Yes, I'm here.
Yep. Okay.
All right.
You are on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Righty.
And then we hope we practiced twice. So
nice. All right. Well, I guess I'll start. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Susan, for that gracious introduction, and thank you, Maine Lakes Society, for putting together this wonderful, informative series. I've been following the topics and things like that. This is a wonderful series, and I applaud Maine Lakes Society for gathering all these wonderful people together on these screens. The weather hasn't always been this nice, so that's not your fault, but thank you for having us, and thanks everybody for taking that afternoon inside and joining us here today. I am going to turn over sharing my screen now. And I have a slideshow I'd like to share with you all here today with lots of beautiful pictures from right here in Maine. I did not Google any photos. They all came from areas near and dear to my heart. The name of this project, as Susan introduced it, is Bringing Nature Home to Maine. Maine Audubon, for those of you not familiar, I'm the Director of Education here at Maine Audubon. Maine Audubon's mission is essentially to conserve Maine wildlife and wildlife habitat. That includes Maine's lakes for loons and other wildlife, but all kinds of other taxa and habitats as well. This project, Bringing Nature Home, is what I think a really exciting combination of Maine Audubon's mission, but also some strategic priorities we have that I'll mention as I go through the talk as well. The project background comes from a couple of different places. First and foremost is the best-selling book of that title, Bringing Nature Home, written by Doug Tallamy, an entomologist at the University of Delaware who lives in very eastern Pennsylvania and has been researching the decline of insects, particularly caterpillars, particularly in developed landscapes like the suburbs where he lives and like many places that many of us are familiar with. The project also comes to us from Jim and Ann Hancock. They provided foundational funding for this project, but also are from the horticulture industry, the industry that I'm going to focus on solving some problems for in the next half hour or so. This program is also similar to a program many of you may be familiar with from National Audubon. Maine Audubon is an independent affiliate of National Audubon, and National Audubon had a program many years ago called Audubon at Home that was about improving habitat in yards and neighborhoods and schoolyards and places like that. And then the last part of the project background is Wild Seed Project, which I'll talk about later in the talk, a Portland-based organization based on conserving native plants just like us. And Wild Seed Project was founded as an organization the very same year that we started this project. So we've been close partners in the landscape literally ever since. So what this project is essentially about is about looking out our windows and instead of separating the different landscapes that we might see out of a car window or the windows at our home or the windows at our camp or our lake house, whatever the case may be, doing a better job integrating 3 levels of function into those landscape. First and foremost, for organizations focused on ecological conservation and wildlife ecology and subjects like that, the ecological function outside our yard is critically important. But we're also just as excited for things like landscape function, what the bloom schedule is, whether you have pretty fall foliage, whether you have edible fruit, things like that that are about us and the landscapes, how they serve us as people. We also are incredibly blessed in Maine with a really, really distinct and defined cultural connection to our landscapes. Maine is unlike many places that way, where this is Maine's lands are part of our heritage, they're part of our identity, they're part of our social fabric in a way that other states and regions can't claim. And so we want to celebrate all of that when we look out the window. So it starts with this image. This is what over 90%, the estimates range from 91 or 92% all the way up to 97 or so. Historically, over 90% of the Maine landscape looked something like this, some version of a mixed hardwood successional forest. Again, that covered over 90% of the landscape. The other up to 10% was habitats like wetlands, alpine zones, meadows, places like that, beaches, other habitats. All of those habitats, the 90% forest and the other 10% of mixed habitats, all have had one primary purpose internationally for millennia, really, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Maine, before even the Wabanaki people were here, Maine has served as an international baby bird factory. Maine has been making baby birds like these fledgling barred swallows for the rest of the world for thousands and thousands of years. The birds have been coming to Maine from all over the world to find mates in our forests and other habitats, to work with that mate to construct a nest, and to hopefully fledge a roost of chicks based on the abundance of insects, especially caterpillars, in Maine's landscape historically. That's why birds and other wildlife have been coming here forever and ever. So this is what I am setting out to do in the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes with you all, is to talk about how we can manage our lakefronts with baby birds in mind, how we can restore some of that breeding and other ecological activity that has been lost. And much of the loss has been on our own from human impact, and much of it has been accidental and inadvertent. And to me, that's the biggest problem. Now that we know these problems, we are better suited to fix them. And so if we're gonna manage for baby birds, and we're gonna work with wildlife ecologists like Susan Gallo, they're gonna teach us that what we need to do to manage for baby birds or any other animals we need to thinking about what those animals need, thinking about which specific species we're targeting. We can't just manage for all baby birds. We have to identify some species that we really want to work to support. And we also have to think about the other related threats that we also want to manage. For example, if we get birds breeding in our lakefront, are we exposing those birds to threats like outdoor cats and other problems that are going to do them in? So it's about managing the threats as well. I think the best way to start with the relationships that we're trying to restore here is a look at a familiar species, a keystone species, if you will, the monarch butterfly. Just like the birds of Maine, monarch butterflies travel here over multiple generations and thousands of miles in order to get to Maine to find their own breeding habitat and a way to procreate their species here in Maine. And so you see this illustration of the monarch depiction, starting with the first generation to emerge from the fir forests of Mexico that will look for milkweed blooming in the Mexican low country. And then that generation of monarchs will proceed north and be nectaring off plants and will repeat the life cycle here in the spaces in between the arrows. And each arrow represents a different generation of monarchs coming to Maine. We see monarchs here in Maine. Peak abundance here is mid-August through mid-October. So it's not a summer species really here in Maine. It's really a back to school species. And that will come up, that will be important later. But my son and I had some fun managing for monarchs many years ago and did some, took lots of pictures that I'm gonna share with you all. And that was a great way to introduce to us the relationship between insects and their host plants. So we were excited one July when we saw monarchs returning, and we were particularly excited when we got this shot in our backyard in Portland of two monarchs mating on a native Joe Pye weed. That is not a milkweed, and the monarchs don't care about milkweed at this point. They just want nectar and each other. At that point, they will be interested in milkweed, exclusively in milkweed, because that's where the female will need a plant from the genus Asclepias here in Maine on which to host her caterpillars. Monarch caterpillars, just like every species of butterfly and every species of moth, has host plants to which they have adapted over thousands of years that are the only leaves that those caterpillars can survive on and grow on. In some cases, those caterpillars can eat a whole variety of species of plants. And in other cases, like the monarchs, those caterpillars are specialists. They can only eat a particular species. And that's what monarchs do. So they lay their eggs on the milkweed, and a week or so later, a tiny little caterpillar will emerge, the first instar, and you can watch those caterpillars grow if you're raising monarch host plants like milkweeds in your yard, and watch those develop and grow before your eyes. This is about a week into the caterpillar phase. That leaf that it's on is about 1.5 inches or 2 inches wide at the most, and that monarch is not even as long as half that leaf is wide. They continue to grow and continue to fatten up, and again, surviving off the milkweed leaves, and you start to see more of a fully defined, fully sized caterpillar about the size of my pinky at this point. Then the monarchs will move off of the milkweed. At this point in their life cycle, these caterpillars and the butterflies that they will become will no longer care about milkweed. Again, they only needed it for the larval phase, for the caterpillar phase. These caterpillars have left milkweed. That is not milkweed that they're on, because they are done eating. They are done gathering nutrients for that phase of their life, and they're ready to move on to the next phase. They will find a sturdy place to do this hanging jay trademark, and that monarch will eventually form a chrysalis in which it will pupate. It will develop into a butterfly. You can watch that development through the clear walls of the chrysalis and start to see telltale signs of a monarch butterfly a week or so in. Towards the end of the second week, you can see all of the telltale signs of a monarch butterfly crammed up inside that tiny little chrysalis. You can see the monarch face down here. You can see the white spots along the base of the monarch's abdomen here, all along in that chrysalis. 2 weeks or so into the chrysalis phase, that monarch will emerge from that chrysalis. It will work on pumping blood to the cartilage of its wings in order to stiffen them up. Contrary to popular belief, those wings are not moist when they emerge. They are completely dry, but they are wrinkled from being cramped up in the chrysalis and need to have cartilage stiffen them up so that they can fly. The other development that the monarch is getting used to is the proboscis, that long straw that it will use to gather nectar. Again, it doesn't care if that nectar comes from milkweed or an exotic plant or an invasive plant, as long as it makes nectar, that monarch will eat it, and it will not care again about milkweed until it's a female looking up for a place to lay her eggs. Once that monarch has fully emerged, it can go back out on the plant that hosted it. That's a picture of the bloom on that swamp milkweed plant that you saw the pictures earlier of the caterpillar on the leaves. And that monarch has landed back in the landscape in the fall, and returning back to that monarch migration map reminds us that the monarchs here in Maine that emerge here are going to live 5 times longer and fly 5 times as far than their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents did. The monarchs that emerge in Maine will be the ones that will return to Mexico and go to sleep in the fir trees in the mountains of Mexico in order to start the migration pattern over again for the following year. So Maine has significance to monarchs in that Maine monarchs need to be just like we do as Mainers. They need to be stronger, fitter, smarter, faster than those that came before them. So we need to make those monarchs here. And monarchs, as I've already indicated from the timing, are going to be emerging from chrysalises in Maine in the fall, in September and October. And this is one of the first places where the horticulture industry and our current practices cause problems for monarchs and lots of other species in the lack of blooming material, nectar-producing plants in our landscapes in September and October. If you live like I do in town in Portland, you see all of your neighbors deadheading and cleaning up their beds for the fall by removing all the plant material, blooming or not, and putting it in leaf bags on the curb to be picked up and hauled off to the dump. Well, that's a problem if you're a monarch looking for sources of nectar like these New England aster, because you're going to fly, you have to fly 5 times as far as your parents did and live 5 times as long. You need good sources of nectar. And it's not just monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are great ambassadors of the host insect relationship, but we need to remember that monarchs have some flaws for being the real champions of feeding baby birds and restoring habitat. Other species like this great spangled fritillary butterfly are going to be nectaring in the landscape at the same time monarchs are, again, late fall. And you can see from this picture that fritillary has already lived out its life as a butterfly. The tattered wings are indications of dodging raindrops and dodging predators and getting wings stuck in jaggedy edges in fence posts and things like that. That butterfly has probably already laid eggs, and those caterpillars are going to pupate over the winter and emerge as butterflies next spring. And so monarchs are sharing this late relationship and all these needs with butterflies and moths that are not going to migrate to Mexico. They're going to stay here. So if we restore milkweed for monarchs, that's going to be a great thing for monarchs, but look what else happens. This is the faded bloom of a common milkweed plant from the Fields Pond Audubon Sanctuary in Holden, Maine. And I sent this photo to Dr. Talamy many years ago and asked him to venture a guess at how many species of insects I might be looking at. And he sent me a list of 11 to 13 probable names of different species of insects. There's a beetle up here, there's a sweat bee here, there's a large wasp here, there's another beetle here, an ant here, somebody's antennae here, somebody's abdomen here, another ant face here, another wasp or bee face here. Lots and lots of other insects are benefiting from action that was taken on behalf of one species of insect. So that makes monarchs a keystone species in that if we take action on behalf of monarchs, lots of other species and potentially lots of other taxa are going to benefit as well. But this is the challenge with monarchs though, and I want to get ready to start our first poll here, Drew, and get ready to open the poll. But because monarchs, the situation is monarchs are not great ambassadors for the pollinator movement because of their lack of interest in particular plants in the pollinator phase. Monarchs also have another challenge if you're really about restoring baby birds, which is what I'm really about. It's less about the insects and the plants and much more about the baby birds. Baby birds, as many of you may know, don't eat monarch caterpillars very much. And in Maine, I have heard studies about the fact that that's because monarchs caterpillars might be toxic and things like that. That wouldn't matter in Maine. In Maine, the best adaptations that the monarch caterpillars have is their timing. They are in the caterpillar phase in Maine at a time of year when the vast majority of birds have moved on from their nests and transitioned either to insects in another part of the world or to different sources of food like fruit or grain. And so the monarchs have a really great existence here in Maine without as many predators for them, given the timing they are. So I want to open the poll here and pose you all a question. And here's the question. In the picture you see before you, are these pollinators? Is the picture you are looking at a picture of pollinators? I'll give you a few minutes there to answer, or a few seconds rather, to answer that question. Your choices are yes, these are pollinators, no, these are not pollinators, or maybe these might be pollinators. So we can go ahead and see. So we're getting some early returns from the polling, and we're showing that 77% of you identified these as not pollinators. And I think you based that answer on the fact that these critters, these caterpillars, will not visit the flowers of the plants that they live on, and therefore will not pollinate other flowers of other plants as caterpillars. So the correct answer is not actually no. The correct answer is probably maybe. These critters will only be pollinators if they make it to the adult phase of their life. And so that's critically important, that if you're going to conserve pollinators and you're not focused on the larval host plant, then you're not actually doing much to conserve pollinators. You're only taking care of the adults. And if you only take care of the adults in a community and your grocery stores only have food that the adults in the community can eat, you're not going to sustain that community for very long. And that's true for monarchs as well. And so I'll skip the second poll, but this is another question. So what about this picture? Is this a pollinator? And I'll skip to this is a Luna moth, a wonderful charismatic moth species here native to Maine. And the answer is no. This is an example of a moth. There are many examples like this in Maine of a moth that doesn't even have mouth parts. This moth will never visit a flower except by accident in its adult phase. And so it gets lumped into pollinator conservation. And this isn't something that your flowers are going to do any good for. The sole purposes of an adult Luna moth is to find a mate in order to lay eggs on its host plant, and for those caterpillars to emerge and the moth to fly around and find another mate to procreate the species. So that's a problem if you're focused on pollinator conservation and you're not including insects that don't actually pollinate. And so this is all about host plants. It's about restoring the plants that have served historically as caterpillar host plants in these landscapes, because those plants are going to be the ones that make the food that baby birds need. The caterpillars are the reason the birds have flown thousands of miles in order to rear young at your lake front or at your camp, because they're counting on the plants that have always been there, have been there through millennia, being there and hosting those species of insects that have been there forever, because they're counting on feeding their nestlings and their hatchlings thousands and thousands of baby of caterpillars. And species, this poses a problem when we're talking about the developed landscapes, because you have species like common milkweed that don't play nicely with others, that spread aggressively and like to take over places. But milkweed, like many other families, has other species in that genus that are just as native to Maine, just as beneficial to monarchs and other wildlife, and will behave nicely in your landscaped environment. And two examples of that are swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, which you're seeing here, hosting one of my neighbor's honeybees in Portland, and Asclepias tuberosa, the beautiful butterfly weed, those orange blossoms that are very distinct. Again, just as native to Maine, just as beneficial to monarchs and other wildlife, and will behave nicely for you in the garden landscape. And this is all, again, I'll remind you, this is all about restoring the plants to host the insects, to feed birds like this blackpoll warbler. This is the migration map for the blackpoll warbler. You'll see its wintering grounds down in South America. It will come north as the days get longer and the insects emerge, and it will be headed a little north of most of us to the boreal forests of Canada. And as the days start getting shorter in August and September, the blackpoll warblers will reverse that process and will all head to southern coastal Maine, so that as a launching point for this epic trip of flying for somewhere between 2 to 14 straight days in order to get back to their wintering grounds without stopping on boats or buoys or islands or things like that. And so Maine becomes a critical point for species of birds like the blackpoll warbler. This is the female blackpoll warbler in a yard in southern Maine, in Windham actually, in 1 September. And knowing the full life cycle and the full migration patterns of a blackpoll warbler reminds us that this bird was getting ready to work its way to the coast and to set off on this epic trip to procreate its species. And so the benefit that this bird was finding in this yard, on this lattice work, by foraging for insects in order to bulk up and get stronger for that epic journey, is critically important for us. And if we're lucky and we have the right camera lens, we may even get a nice smile out of her in thanks for our conservation work. So the 3 dimensions of the Bringing Nature Home project that Maine Audubon has been working on for about 6 years now, and around which we seek to partner with Maine Lakes Society and the LakeSmart program and lots of other ways. And we would like to cast an additional lens on the plant choices that we make in order to prioritize the 3 dimensions most important for us in the wildlife habitat conservation business. Number 1, species of plants that match the place. We want to promote straight species of Maine natives. We would prefer those vastly over native plants that are regionally native or continentally native. Those would be suitable alternatives. We also are aware of cultivars of natives where specific varieties have been identified for specific traits via horticulture, and that there is that possibility as well. But our preference is to focus on species that are native to Maine and that are straight species that have not been tinkered with at all by horticulture or others, that have been left to their own devices. We also encourage managing and cultivating those plants in a way that reaps all of the benefit. For example, if you deadhead all of your goldenrod and aster as soon as the blooms start to fade in late September, you will have taken an incredibly important food source for migrating and residential birds, resident birds in November or so, when they're looking for those seeds to be ready and on the top of those plants where they belong. And then the last thing has to do more with the straight species. We are espousing genetic diversity and sustainability that comes from natural propagation. Again, the more time plants spend being tinkered with in horticulture labs or in genetic modification institutions or otherwise, that nature is being messed with and could potentially be compromised, although the jury is still out on that. And so the plants that what we're looking to do is we're looking for plants like milkweed that get to go to seed, that those seeds can be collected, since there's so much competition in the seed bed out there right now from exotics and invasive species. We're gonna have to give these native species a little leg up, and we're gonna have to capture seeds off of them when they do get ready. And we're gonna have to sow them in pots and sort of regulated environments like this one on my deck. You can see those are all different species of native plants being grown from seed. The caging around there is to keep the gray squirrels from switching out my labels and mixing up my plants, because I'm still learning too. And then those seeds get left over the winter just like they do in nature. And in the spring and in mid-May or so, this is a great time, you start to see the seedlings emerge and start to see germinating after the cold stratification and the freeze thaw has broken the dormancy, and you can see the leaves starting to unfurl from those seeds. These are developing, all of those shots are developing butterfly weed seedlings. Butterfly weed was Asclepias tuberosa, that plant that I showed you with the beautiful orange flowers. And butterfly weed is one of the species of native plants that, if you're lucky, you might get a bloom the first year that you grow them. So if you sow the seeds in the fall, they will germinate in the spring, and you might get a bloom out of that plant that first August or so, if you're lucky. And growing species like Asclepias tuberosa has additional imperative and significance. If we go to the state registry of rare plants managed by the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry and the Maine Natural Areas Program, their database lists Asclepias tuberosa as potentially extirpated in Maine. That means that the last naturally occurring stand of butterfly weed in the state of Maine was last observed in 1985 in Old Orchard Beach. And we haven't seen it in nature since then. It is extinct in Maine. But as you saw from the previous slides, it is still growing and thriving and reproducing in my backyard and lots of other places in Maine, and it can be restored. And the monarch butterflies that are going to lay eggs on my butterfly weed this late summer have no idea. They did not get the memo that butterfly weed has been extirpated from Maine, because they're still finding it. And so the way to find these plants is really exciting. This is the database where a lot of Doug Talmay's research lives. What he has done is National Wildlife Federation is hosting this website. They have a native plant finder .org or a native plant finder tool, and you can enter your zip code. I entered the worst zip code in Maine for wildlife habitat, 04101, downtown Portland. And you can see that database will spit out a list of genera of plants, so the families of plants, in order of their historic record of hosting species of caterpillars, of butterflies and moths. So throughout history, according to all historic record, goldenrod in 04101, there are 124 matches between a species of butterfly or moth caterpillar and a species of goldenrod plant in this zip code, and so on down the line. 124 species, native strawberry, 81 species, native sunflower, 60 species, and so on. And if you click on, if I were to click on the sunflower card, for example, that will pull up a list of the species native in my zip code and the 60 species that use this as this plant as a caterpillar host plant, and some of the examples of which. So again, if you decide to move on from managing for monarch butterflies and instead you want to manage for climbing moth this year, you're gonna have to have the climbing moth host plant in addition to the monarch host plant. And so you're gonna need a diversity of plants. So these are some other resources that you can check out. I'm gonna give you a quick tutorial on the Maine Native Plant Finder, but Wild Seed Project has a wonderful website, especially focused on growing native plants from seeds on your own. I love Native Plant Trust. That is the new name for the same wonderful organization that was formerly called New England Wildflower Society. Same great organization, great new name. USDA has a plant database that will help you identify. That's what we use as our reference for natives. They pull data from BONAP, which is Biota of North America program. And then Native Haunts is a little nursery as well. So with that, I am about out of time, and I did want to show you the Native Plant Finder very quickly. I'm gonna pause my share for a second while I switch screens here. And I just want to show you this. I'll close here. This is the Maine Native Plants website. I hope to integrate this with Maine Lake Society's LakeSmart programs eventually. But this is a brand new website. It has not been launched to the public yet. You can go to this website and you can filter, again, mainenativeplants.org. You can filter by the month that you're interested in, June time, the area, the kind of sunlight you get in that spot, the size that you want. You just want as many caterpillars as you can. And your mother-in-law really loves hummingbirds, so it would be cool if those plants attracted hummingbirds when she's here in June. And that will give you 2 great options for species to plant with those criteria. And each of those species cards will give you some more information. You can see photos and you can download an individual information sheet that has more about that plant. Again, mainenativeplants.org. And with that, I will close by saying that Maine Audubon is waiting to launch this. You can go there this afternoon and fully test drive it. All the functions are working. It's up there on the World Wide Web. We have not promoted it until we finalize plans for our native plant sales starting within the next couple of weeks. We are starting sales at Fields Pond in Holden up north. We are announcing a list on email and on our website on this Saturday, and you can place an order at our Fields Pond Center over the phone or over email and arrange for curbside pickup there. A week or so after that, we will be launching online sales of native plants at Maine Audubon's Gilsland Farm Center in Falmouth, and you will be able to complete your whole order online and select a pickup time and then come and find a box with your name on it and take your plants home. So with that, that's a quick introduction. I only have a couple minutes for questions. Thanks so much for your time.
Hey, Eric, sorry. Took me a little minute here to get my bearings. Thanks so much. That was a ton of really great information. And I'm thinking as off the cuff that perhaps when the sale's on and the plants are out, maybe we could do a little like an interview or something, you know, a short live thing. I think there are some definite questions about specific species, and maybe we could do a little cooperative thing where we walk through some of the species that would be particularly good for lakes.
I would love that, and I would also welcome the opportunity to work with individual associations as well. And again, I think Susan Gallo and Maine Lake Society is a wonderful conduit for us to the world of lake conservation.
Yeah, so if everybody has lots of questions, this is just the beginning of this relationship. We have a great subcommittee of LakeSmart people who are working on they're working on planting issues. They're working with how we can get in touch with nurseries and promote LakeSmart as a concept and LakeSmart plants. And LakeSmart, or plants that would be friendly for LakeSmart and vegetative buffers. But I'll ask you a couple of questions. We definitely, for LakeSmart, for vegetative buffers, we definitely promote native plants as much as we can, but we run into the problem, of course, of nurseries not carrying them. So they often have cultivars. You mentioned the best thing to do is get right back to the native strain. So do you think that, if you can get a near native as a cultivar, is that better? That's better than a non-native? Or do you have suggestions for, other than coming to the Maine Audubon plant sale and other nursery you mentioned, what are options for homeowners who are trying to go the native route?
Absolutely. And definitely a little bit of compromise is almost always appropriate, and you will have to make some compromises. So I gave a couple examples of places where you may decide to do a cultivar of a native. That would be preferable. The challenge with cultivars is not actually a real challenge, it's a potential problem. The cultivars, there is not the body of research into cultivars and their ability to host insects the way that there's 400, 500 years of naturalist records and other things associated with the straight species. So Maine Audubon is of the position that while the horticulture industry tries to figure out if these cultivars are actually compromised or not, we'll leave the burden of proof on them to prove to us that they are not compromised. And in the meantime, we will stick to what we know works, which is the straight species without any quoted names there. So your best bet is to find them. Some species are harder to find than others, but together we can change the marketplace. And the more of us leave a nursery without buying a cultivar, the more those nurseries are likely to start stocking. If we continue to compromise and settle, the nurseries have no reason to shift with us. And so that's what we're trying to promote. That's
great. Somebody in the Q&A said MaineNativePlant.org is not working, and I just double checked it. It's MaineNativePlants.org. So
yes,
add an S to that.
Yes.
That's all right.
One Maine, one native, multiple plants. Yeah. Yep. Maine Native Plants with an S.org.
And then does the Maine Native Plant Finder have all kinds in terms of bushes, perennials, trees? Does it have all the?
There are 60 species there, from little bitty, grasses and ground covers, little native strawberries, all the way up to 100-foot tall trees like black cherries, white oaks, things like that. Lots of shrubs. Yeah.
Terrific. Great. Well, we're just hitting it right on target in terms of time. Hold on, I'm just going to share my screen to get to just a quick wrap up. Somebody mentioned about specific native plants for the shoreland zone, and we'll follow up with that. As I mentioned, this is just kind of the beginning of a relationship with Maine Audubon and pursuing this native plants, and there's a LakeSmart subcommittee I mentioned that's really hard at work at this. I will just wrap up by saying thank you to Eric. Great talk. I think we're going to get a lot of positive feedback. There's a short 5-question evaluation when you close out this webinar. It'll bump you to that. Please take just it won't even take a minute to fill it out. We'll send out a recording of the webinar in the next couple of days by email. So if you want to share it with anybody else, your Lake Association friends, you'll have that. Next week, remember to come back for Citizens on the Front Line of Lake Monitoring and Protection with Scott Williams and Roberta Hill from Lake Stewards of Maine. And of course, if you like what you heard, definitely check out our website. We're getting a new website next month, but check out what we have at MaineLakesSociety.org, and we will hopefully see you next week. And thank you again to Eric for a great presentation, and to all of you for attending. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of this beautiful, beautiful day.